President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria and the withdrawal of his invitation to host the next G7 summit at his South Florida resort, just some of the big headlines tonight. Here to discuss them, Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio from Capitol Hill. Senator, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
First, I want to play the president at the cabinet meeting about this effort to pull the U.S. troops out of Syria.
We're working with the Kurds. We have a good relationship with the Kurds, but we never agreed to protect the Kurds. We fought with them for 3.5 to 4 years. We never agreed to protect the Kurds for the rest of their lives. And we helped them. Don't forget, we helped the Kurds. Everyone said the Kurds helped us. That's true. We helped the Kurds. They're no angels.
Your reaction to that, Senator?
Well, I think this is a lot more than about the Kurds, and I think it's a lot more than just two choices. It's not just a choice of withdrawing or staying forever. I think there was a third alternative, and you got some insight into it by what the Vice President and the Secretary of State were able to achieve. So I think the first thing I would point to is I think it was the abrupt nature of the withdrawal without any sort of planning about what would immediately happen. That's really problematic. I would also say that it's helpful to ISIS. It's going to help them to reconstitute themselves, not just in Syria, but also crossing over into Iraq. I think it's helpful to Iran. It's going to give them more operating space. It's going to create leverage for them in that country where they can use to supply Hezbollah, attack Israel, attack Americans. And by the way, I think the Iranians are going to go to the Turks and say, we've got a lot of leverage. We have a lot of groups operating up there, but you got to help us evade sanctions if you want us to help you. And I also think they're going to use it to pressure us to get out of the remaining place we have in southern Syria, which is used to buffer both Jordan and Israel. And the last point I would make is that this is also really damaging for our international credibility. I mean, now you're concerned that Putin thinks, well, maybe I can test America in the Baltic states, or the Chinese think they can test us in the South China Sea or Taiwan. And I imagine allies around the world who are also questioning our reliability. And I also one more point, and that is allies in the region and around the world, also in Asia, who are now saying to themselves, maybe we're not as confident in America as we used to be. Maybe we should arm ourselves with nuclear weapons. You could have arms races now developing in Asia, in the Middle East. So there's a lot to unpack here. There's no doubt that all of this was explained, and that's why planning, if you were going to do something like this, was really important, and that didn't happen either.
But Senator, the president's essentially saying you can't stay there forever. Do you sense tonight that troops are somehow going to go back into Syria? There's some sense that they might be protecting oil fields. What's your sense of that tonight?
Well, I can't answer that because, 48 hours before this decision was made, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I'm not blaming him, said we were going to be there for the foreseeable future. By the way, we're talking about 1,000 people. What I've heard is that we're not really leaving the Middle East. We're just relocating them over into Iraq. And from Iraq, they're going to be conducting some of the same operations. And then I saw a media report that we may leave some troops behind at some of these oil fields. But you know why, if we do that? It's because the Iranians are trying to get their hands on those oil fields because it means revenue. They can recoup all that money they spent in propping up Assad. Again, ultimately, we're not going to be there forever. But if you were going to begin the process of diminishing our presence, it should have been done with some planning, not simply sort of a one phone call thing. And that is, as much as anything else, part of this problem.
So what should be done now?
That's a great question. I don't have an easy answer for that. I mean, there are some problems that are very difficult to unpack when they happen. I'd be curious to see what ideas are floating out there, about what we can do to continue to diminish Iran's ability to leverage off of Syria to attack us, to attack Israel, to threaten shipping in the Gulf, and so forth. But there's no easy answer to the question you've just asked. The damage from this, in terms of that sort of thought, is going to be difficult to undo.
I want to turn to another question, and that is the G7 summit. The thought that it was going to be at Doral, the president saying that this was the right decision, and then walking it back. Your thoughts on that?
Well, there's no way they didn't know it wouldn't be controversial. So you almost wonder if they didn't do it. The president likes to poke the media. He likes to poke outrage in his opponents, and so they had to have known that. I have two thoughts about it. The first is I'm from Florida. I think it would be wonderful for Florida to have the G7, especially South Florida, and it would be a great thing for our community. I think we'd be a really good host. The flip side of it is I recognize that people are going to look at it and say, in the middle of everything that's going on, why would you do that? It actually undermines your corruption argument that you've been making about Biden and so forth. And then ultimately the president changed his mind on it. So I thought it would have been great for Florida, but I recognize the complications that it came with. It wasn't the end of the world. It probably also, in hindsight, wasn't the best decision. But
this is
certainly
how
was good
for
Florida.
White House Chief of Staff described that decision this weekend.
The president isn't one for holding back his feelings and his emotions about something. He was honestly surprised at the level of pushback. At the end of the day, he still considers himself to be in the hospitality business.
There was a lot of reaction to that last line.
Well, I think what he meant is that that's the background he comes from. I mean, he's a person from the hospitality business. He's thinking about it as a host for an event. That's what I think he meant by it. But on the first part about the outrage and so forth, look, I mean, there's outrage about everything the president does. I mean, there are some out there that are outraged by everything he does, and there are some things he does that are outrageous. So, but on this front, I think he had to have known, my view anyway, that there would be some negative reaction to it. That said, like I said, look, I would have been great for Florida, but I understand that the pushback against it, but it's a non-issue now, I guess.
All right, last thing. The president talked to my colleague Sean Hannity. They've just released a piece of it. This one about Ukraine and Democrats in Ukraine. Take a listen to this.
When you hear about Ukraine, and you've been hearing about it, I heard Clinton was involved. I heard they got somebody who wrote the fake dossier. Was it out of Ukraine? All of the things that happened. And I assume that the Attorney General, I would like the Attorney General to find out what's going on. Because you know what? We're investigating corruption.
Is it wrong to investigate corruption and that phone call and what he's talked about since publicly when it comes to Ukraine and what has happened there?
Well, two separate things he talked about. The first is evidence that some of the stuff that happened in 2016 originated in Ukraine. We've just conducted a very extensive 2-year investigation in the Intelligence Committee. We haven't seen evidence of that. If there is, though, I would be interested in seeing it. That would be important, but we haven't seen it. On the second point about investigating corruption, I don't think there's a problem with that at all. I think where this got complicated is that it tied into Joe Biden, who at the time was leading in the polls in the Democratic primary and could very well be his opponent. And so you can just imagine the link to those two things. And what it's probably a reason why he should not have raised it in that conversation. That said, obviously, that's where we are right now. But I think that really, it's not the corruption part that really got everybody stirred up, at least on the other side of the aisle, and some on mine. But the link to Biden, who was going to be his opponent, and his president's also right when he points to letters written by members of the Senate threatening to cut off aid to Ukraine if they didn't do certain things. So it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack and a number of different issues, Senator. But if you, sitting there today, look at the impeachment efforts by Democrats, how do you think it plays out?
I think impeachment and removal of a president is one of the most extraordinary things anybody could ever do. If it reaches a trial in the Senate, it'll be the most important vote any of us will ever take, because you are literally saying we're going to cancel the results of a valid Democratic election, and you're doing it, by the way, probably less than a year from a new election in which all this information will be out there. And I'm still shocked at how people just take that lightly and just throw it around. I think something like that needs to be used very sparingly. It's damaging. It's traumatic for the country. If you thought the Kavanaugh thing was divisive, this will be that times 100 in terms of the trauma and divisiveness it will cause. It's an extraordinary measure that hurts the country no matter what the outcome of it is. And ultimately, it should be based on two things: the facts, all of the facts, and what's in the best interest of our country, given that moment in time and the particulars of it. So a lot of people are so cavalier. There are people in the House that wanted to impeach the president before he was even sworn in. And I see others that are basically saying, well, let's just circle the wagons and stifle this. This is a really big deal, and it's talked about in a very cavalier way by some. I think we should take that very seriously, let it play out, let's get the facts, and then we'll act in accordance to what's in the best interest of the United States of America at that particular moment.
Senator Marco Rubio up on Capitol Hill, we appreciate the time.
Thank you.